Let's welcome our guest, Dan Eberhardt. Dan is CEO of Canary, one of the largest privately owned oilfield services companies in the United States. He's been a consultant to the energy industry in North America, Asia, and Africa, and his commentaries appear in Forbes and many other publications. He's a frequent guest on Fox News, CNBC, and other top networks, and the author of the acclaimed book, The Switch, America's Global Energy Renaissance. Dan, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. So oil prices came back up over $50 a barrel, now pushing close to 70. Is that mostly a good thing or bad thing in your opinion?
Well, I think it's a good thing for the oil and gas business, but I think if they go too much higher, it's going to have negative implications for the overall economy as far as our growth and stuff.
And why is that?
Well, I think it just there's a certain point when where it starts impacting, capital investment, and it starts to hurt consumer spending. And I think that we're near a tipping point. I think somewhere around $75 a barrel is where we hit that tipping point that it starts actually being, continues to be good for the oil and gas industry, but has negative implications for consumers and for capital investment and the overall economic growth.
So we're getting reasonably close to that. And I know you've written a lot about the fact that, in your mind, geopolitical risks are some of the biggest risks facing the oil industry today. Are those the things you think are most likely to push us up potentially over $75 a barrel? And if so, which of those concern you most?
Sure. So, I think it's been a relatively quiet 3-4 year period as far as geopolitical tension, shooting wars, refineries being, harmed or attacked, and just geopolitical uncertainty in general. And I think that's really ending right now. You've got, production in Angola is falling massively. You've got production in Venezuela that's dropping precipitously. And then you've got this looming Iran deal that Trump may or may not pull out of on May 12th. And then you've also got the Russia situation with all these sanctions. And then finally, there's the kind of proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran and Yemen. And I think, any one of these factors, and especially if there's 2, 3, or 4 happen at one time, could really send oil spiking, not out of control, but pretty high.
Which would you say are the top 2 of those that would affect us adversely to the greatest extent as a country?
Sure. So I think I think oil is going to move, $5 up or $5 down when Trump announces a decision. I think on the Iran deal, I think that's about half priced in. I also think there's very big implications in Venezuela, and I think that's going to happen soon. Their production was about 2.2 million barrels a day in 2016. It's right now about 1.6 million barrels, and I'm looking for that to fall to around 1 million barrels a day by the end of the year. And I think that that's going to have there's going to be a lot of unrest and potentially regime change in Venezuela, and I think that could be affect the oil markets, but also a lot of other things.
What would have to happen to push oil prices, do you think, over $100 a barrel? Would all these geopolitical risks have to occur in real life at the same time, or what?
I mean, not all of them. And look, the Venezuelan production falling and the Angola production falling, I mean, that's a fact that's happening. I think an escalation in Syria that pitted the U.S. against either Iran or Russia or both in an active shooting war, I think that would be tremendous. And I think if something happened between Iran and Saudi Arabia, that would also be pretty, pretty precipitous to push oil higher. But again, I think even as a guy in the oil and gas industry, $60 oil is great, $70 oil is great, $80 oil is great, but I really, $100 oil is really bad for us too. I don't, because it creates other problems. I kind of hope it doesn't get there.
I hope your $75 a barrel prediction ends up panning out. That would be a really good scenario. We need to take a commercial break right now. Dan, please stay with us. We have a lot more. In fact, we're going to talk when we get back about the effects of increased U.S. production and how that may or may not offset, or to what extent it might offset this. So you stay with us right now. We'll be right back with more words of wisdom from Dan Eberhardt. Now it's time to welcome back Dan Eberhardt, CEO of Canary Oil. So, okay, the United States has increased its production. I know we've gotten to a point where we actually now are a net exporter of finished petroleum, finished products. How much do you see this increase being able to prevent some of the potential for an oil crisis such as we saw back in the 1970s?
Sure. So I think that actually what's going to happen is the worldwide demand growth is going to increase about 1.5 million barrels a day. And I think in 2018, and I think the U.S. production is actually going to increase by a fairly similar amount. So I really think the surging U.S. oil production is really kind of a swap for the increased world demand growth. And I think all these other geopolitical risks that I mentioned before the break are really potentially a catalyst for oil to spike, much higher than where it is now.
So can we as a country get to the point where we have the right trade balance with oil in total, where we're exporting more than we're importing, or at bare minimum we're self-sufficient?
Sure. Well, I think that we're very much headed there. Oil exports have been reaching and approaching 2 million barrels a day. So from a standing start of zero 2.5 years ago, it's really quite impressive that we've been able to do that. I think that for us to export more than 3 million barrels a day, I think there's going to have to be a lot more infrastructure. I think we're running out of takeaway capacity, so pipelines in West Texas, and I think that we need more port facilities for the offtake in the kind of Texas, Louisiana, Gulf Coast area to boost the production above 3 million barrels a day. But I think that, I've always thought energy independence is a bit of a misnomer. I think we need to be able to trade certain grades of crude with Canada, certain grades of crude with Mexico, but our refineries are hungry and we want to operate the refineries at 100% capacity. So I think that we will always be importing some of the heavier stuff from Mexico, and I think they'll be taking some of our lighter crude, and I think that you'll see some swaps around the Canadian border, and I think that just makes sense. But the surging U.S. production really does limit our kind of national security risk a lot from where it was like in the 1970s, for instance.
Sure, absolutely. Now, do you think with President Trump at the helm, at least for a little bit longer, maybe longer than that, do you think that'll help us in terms of boosting our own production in this country?
Well, I think Trump has been a friend of the oil and gas industry and a friend of business. I think he's made several steps that are positive towards the development of using American oil and gas and unleashing American energy, and I expect him to continue to do so. So I think it's a net positive for the industry, unlike the kind of regulatory climate and regulatory restrictions and the stalling on the Keystone Pipeline and some of these kind of initiatives that came out of the Obama administration.
So in 30 seconds we have left, all this trade war talk, is that a big concern also in this over the next year?
Yeah, it's a big concern for me. I'm against the tariffs on steel and aluminum. I think that it's actually a hindrance to American manufacturing. I also think it's a hindrance to the U.S. oil and gas business, which has to compete against West African oil and OPEC oil and others. And so I would really rather that not happen. I do think the Trump administration, though, is bold in a way that Obama just wouldn't pick up the phone or wouldn't pick up the tempo and try to fight China on trade. And I think Trump's doing the right thing by trying to get them to the table and get some concessions.
Yeah, he's not a person shy of negotiation. We all know that. Coming up in just a bit, we'll talk more with Dan Eberhardt, all about oil and energy in the markets. Stay tuned. We'll be right back on The Income Generation. Okay, we're back with Dan Eberhardt of Canary Oil. Dan, what are your thoughts about the market, the stock market, and what's happening today? How much of this volatility we've seen over the last 3 months has to do with oil prices, whether directly or indirectly?
Sure. So I think that the oil price and the market have been more correlated than historically, but I think it has more to do with the kind of macroeconomic growth numbers and then the trade, the trade, I would say, scuffle at this point. I think we're a little short of a trade war, but that kind of bellicose talk and rhetoric coming out of the Trump administration about trade has got more to do with it than oil prices for the past couple of months.
Now, the concern is always inflation, and I know you kind of alluded to this, and right now the markets seem to be afraid of inflation. So is that kind of where you peg that $75 a barrel number, thinking that if we get much over that, it could be an inflation trigger, and that might be negative for the markets in general?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I think we're going to see labor inflation, and I think that we're likely to see other types of inflation too. And I think that's going to push oil higher as oil is priced in dollars. And I think that eventually will have a cooling effect on the economic growth of the overall economy, and also cool some of the earnings, in the S&P 500 and the Dow too as well, which obviously affects the market.
How about alternative energy sources? There's always a lot of talk about them. Are they still increasing at a rapid rate? Or are they taking a bigger percentage of our country's energy need? Or is that kind of leveled off because prices have been low for a while and we've gotten complacent?
Sure. Sure. Well, to some degree, I think that it's the returns aren't there from the way that we analyze stuff. But I think that a lot, so I think solar is difficult to make work economically without subsidies. I think wind has got a better economic case. I think that we're going to see increased adoption of electric vehicles as we move forward, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years out. But I don't see that dampening the demand growth for oil until we hit something like year 10 in the future.
So tell us about your book, The Switch, America's Global Energy Renaissance.
Sure. So it basically talks about how U.S. shale has changed the way we look for oil, the way we find oil, and what's going to happen. And it kind of was right there on the precipice before the downturn happened. And it, I don't think that the timing is not completely correct, but it basically predicts kind of what actually happened with there being too much supply and that causing prices to collapse. And the book, I think it's a good kind of airplane read, and it explains energy. What I found that people find most interesting about The Switch is where we talk about how oil relates to natural gas, relates to coal, relates to electricity, and how that mixes together. And I think that's got some good reviews, and people enjoy kind of learning more about how all those are puzzle pieces that fit together in our national energy grid.
I think you're right that a lot of people really don't fully understand that, and I probably don't either, frankly, how they all integrate with each other. So you said it's an airplane read, which of course is my favorite. I love being able to read a book in 2-3 hours. So if you were talking to our viewers, the income generation members, baby boomers, either retired or within 10 years of retirement, in 30 seconds or so, what is it they're going to get out of this that's going to help them better prepare for their retirement by reading the book?
Sure. Well, I think they're going to get a better understanding of the energy marketplace and a better understanding of where to invest within the energy space in terms of MLPs, exploration and production companies, and service companies, and then a little bit on understanding, okay, what's behind electricity? Well, it's some coal, it's some nuclear, and it's some natural gas, and how all that mix works together.
So basically, how to manage the energy sector of their portfolio in a better way by looking forward.
Yes.
Great. Dan, that's very good. I really appreciate it. And tell our viewers where they can find your book.
Sure. So it's on Amazon. I'd also like to say you can follow me on Twitter at DANKEBERHART.
All right. On Twitter and at Amazon. Dan, so much for coming to the show today. Thank you. I appreciate it. It's good spending time with you.
Thanks for having me.
And you stay with us too. We'll be right back with a lot more here on the Income Generation. Stay with us.